Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey, and on this episode, I'm joined by Jeff Keckley and Ron Rosenthal. Jeff and Ron both work out of our Chicago office. Jeff, Ron, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to be here.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to be with you.
Yeah, great to have you both. So ownership guidelines have become a nearly universal compensation governance policy among public companies. Their use has become so common, many compensation committees give minimal thought to their importance as a tool for driving executive behaviors internally and demonstrating alignment to shareholders externally. Today, we're going to dive deeper into the purpose behind ownership guidelines, how they're typically structured, and the key factors committees should consider when evaluating and designing these guidelines. So Ron, maybe we can start with you, and it would be great if you could just give us kind of a high-level 30,000-foot overview of exactly what is an ownership guideline. What's the general purpose? Why do companies have them? And what are some of the viewpoints externally of how ownership guidelines are viewed and considered?
Yep, happy to, Ryan. The stock ownership guidelines, as their name suggests, require covered executives to own a specific amount of stock typically over a required period of time. And the reason companies adopt stock ownership guidelines or requirements are really to further align management's interests with those of shareholders. In other words, the concept is if management owns a substantial amount of company stock and they have skin in the game, if you will, they're more apt to think and act like owners. And so it's really all about creating that alignment of interests between the management team and shareholders. And the way those are typically structured to achieve that objectives is to first identify a covered group of executives that will be subject to the guidelines or requirements. Often that includes the CEO and their direct reports. And in some organizations that may extend another level or two down in the organization. We'll talk about that further. But most companies will establish a set amount of stock that covered executives are required to own. That ownership requirement or guideline typically tiers down within the covered group of executives, with each tier having a set amount of stock that they're required to own. Typically, those guidelines are denominated or structured as a multiple of base salary. So in other words, each executive is required typically to own a certain multiple of their base salary. And they're required to do that over a set period of time. On occasion, you will see executives that are required to own a set amount of stock. In other words, a fixed number of shares, but that is certainly a minority practice. The predominant practice is to denominate guidelines as a multiple of the base salary. As I mentioned, most companies do require executives to achieve that level of ownership over a predetermined period. Typically, it's 5 years. So executives subject to the guideline will have to achieve that ownership over or by the fifth anniversary of being subject to the guideline. And in many cases, the ownership requirement comes into play either when they're adopted, if a company hasn't previously adopted ownership guidelines, or when the executive is hired or promoted into a position that is subject to the guidelines. Often there is a kind of a reset of that time period if either the ownership guidelines are increased. So for example, if the required multiple increases, or the executive is promoted into a position, if there is a tiered approach that is subject to a more rigorous guideline. So often that time period is reset, if you will, if either of those events occurred. As I mentioned, it's often a tiered approach. So the CEO will be in their own tier typically, and that often looks like 5 to 6 times of salary. Their second tier is usually kind of that next level of executives in the organization. Could be the COO if there's a separate president, or the CFO of the company, and that might be 3 times salary. And then depending on the approach the company adopts, you might have 1 or 2 other tiers, which could range from 2 to 3 times salary. So that is a typical cascading structure, kind of 5 times, 3 times, and anywhere from 1 to 2 times for that next tier, depending on how deep in the organization those guidelines extend.
And how about externally? How do investors and proxy advisors look at guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great question. So large asset managers, large investors, proxy advisors, they expect to see publicly traded companies adopt and maintain meaningful ownership guidelines for the leadership team. And the reason is, again, as I mentioned, these force executives to build ownership stake and to foster that alignment between shareholders and the management team. And it's also just generally viewed as a good governance practice and a good tool for mitigating excessive risk taking. So, from an external standpoint, it's become a basic expectation that companies adopt and maintain robust guidelines for their executive team.
Okay. So we've kind of established, ownership guidelines. The purpose is to create this base level of ownership that the senior team is owning in the company. One other just quick follow up, Ron, before we pull Jeff into the conversation. Is the purpose of these to kind of force executives to go out and buy stock on their own, or is the thinking in most companies that they'll just accumulate this through compensation?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's the general thinking is that through the normal course compensation program that the executives participate in, typically where these guidelines come into play, those executives are participants in the long-term incentive program. So rather than there being an expectation that the executives go into the market and purchase stock to comply these guidelines, the expectation is that they will accumulate ownership by their participation in the long-term incentive program and accumulate that ownership over time. Now, that's not to say that sometimes executives don't go into the market and make open market purchases, but that's typically not the expectation via the adoption of ownership guidelines.
Okay. So Jeff, I want to talk a little bit about how pay mix and the broader long-term incentive design might influence and stock ownership guidelines. So how do those the kind of the broader design, how does that influence the guidelines? How do those things work together?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. And that's a good question. I think that's actually one of the reasons why we're suggesting that companies take a closer look at their stock ownership guidelines. So pay mix does have a direct impact on how challenging it can be for an executive to achieve their ownership guideline. All right, as Ron explained, the stock ownership guidelines, they're essentially universally set as a multiple of salary. Frankly, I don't necessarily think this is logical, right? Salary is a cash component, and the policy is really intended to have executives hold, equity, which is, as Ron was explaining, is part of what they're earning through the long-term incentive program. But regardless, it's a universal practice to establish the required level based on a multiple of salary, and so pay mix absolutely comes into play. Right? And we know that pay mix differs across companies, right? I mean, it can be due to the size of the company. Larger companies tend to have a larger percentage of total pay LTI, often because pay tends to be larger when you increase the company size. Different industries can also differences in pay mix. And so understanding what the pay mix is, there's of course a salary, bonus, and long-term incentives, and how the relationship of your long-term incentive award compares to the salary level certainly is going to factor into your stock ownership guidelines.
So it sounds like there might even be some modeling that a company might want to do if they're putting these in for the first time, just to ensure that the granting that you're making on an annual basis will allow someone to achieve the guideline within the time frame that you've established. Is that something you sometimes see companies do?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think as a baseline, you just need to be cautious, right? That if you're using a stock ownership multiple that's consistent, that's basically the common market practice across the industry, that there might be a different impact on your own executives, right? I mean, Ron mentioned that the 6 times multiple for CEO has essentially become the norm. 3 to 4 times for the NEOs has become the norm. And so I think it's really our advice is to look at what that ownership value is. You talked about a modeling. So let's just take an example, right? If an executive earns $400,000 in salary and has a 3 times ownership multiple, that makes their ownership requirement, their stock ownership requirement, $1.2 million. Compare that to what the annual LTI grant and ask, is this requirement, is it appropriate? Right. And you see companies model this out, right? And they take things into consideration like the tax impact, potential stock price growth, what the PSU payouts may be. But looking at it from that perspective and trying to understand how requiring are these ownership guidelines, looking at what we're asking our executives to hold as in relationship to what we're granting them annually will, I think, shed light on whether or not any changes are necessary, right? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. But if you're looking at the modeling and you're coming out that it's likely going to be less than 2 years for an executive to achieve the guideline, it's probably too low, right? If it's going to take an executive 5+ years to achieve the guideline, then that might suggest that your guideline's too high. And maybe the last thing I'll say on this is it's good to look across the executive team as well for consistency, right? If a couple of your executives, you're expecting them to achieve that ownership guideline in 2 or 3 years, but others, based on the pay mix, it's going to take them 5+ years. That may suggest that a change to the multiple to maybe 1 or 2 of your executives is appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we continue on kind of diving even deeper into the ownership guideline, I did want to ask a question that I think might help dispel some confusion, because I think it was just very recent we had a podcast recording that was on the topic of holding power and really looking at stock holding power as a retention tool. What's different? I mean, is there any overlap between looking at holding power and ownership guidelines, or are these really just two completely different governance tools?
Yeah. No, it's important to make that distinction. And these really are two completely different governance tools, right? The stock ownership guidelines that we're talking about is looking at essentially vested shares. What is the value that the executives holding, that they own, and making sure that there's alignment with shareholders' interests by making sure that they hold a certain amount of value that they outright own, right? On the other hand, I would say holding requirements is looking at unvested equity. So it's the equity that's restricted, that's if the executive were to leave, it's forfeited. And so in the holding power analysis is really to understand what is that retentiveness of our LTI awards. How much value is left on the table if an executive were to leave, and it looks at truly what is that hold for the executive.
Okay. So yeah, if we think of almost like a Venn diagram of stock holdings of an individual, holding power is almost entirely unvested. It's what you're going to give up if you leave, whereas ownership guidelines really cover everything that you're going to retain because it's fully owned. So that's a good distinction. So Ron, let's talk about participation a little bit. We've touched a little bit on some of the guidelines and how they might impact the most senior executives. Do companies go deeper with guidelines? And if so, like what is the right level of employee that you should extend these to?
Yeah, this is a key issue that all companies need to address when they adopt or modify their ownership guidelines. And let me just start by saying there really is no one size fits all approach. There is no standard that each company can apply. It really is a question that each company needs to answer based on a few considerations. It's really should be based on their objectives with these guidelines, their overall pay philosophy, and their culture. So for example, for companies that want to create an ownership culture more deep in the leadership team, the guidelines might extend well beyond the CEO and their direct reports. It might go down another 2 levels through, for example, a VP level. Other companies may take a more limited approach to participation or coverage by ownership guidelines. So other companies might limit it to a more select group of executives that can have the greatest impact on performance and results. So it could be as narrow as the top 5. It could be kind of a defined leadership team, which maybe the top 10 to 15 executives. And again, that decision will really depend on the company's objectives and the messaging it wants to send both externally and to the executive team about expectations to build ownership and foster that alignment of interests, not only with shareholders, but among the management team, winning and losing together.
Yeah. So from a disclosure perspective, companies are only required to disclose guidelines that cover those named officers, right? So to the extent
right.
that they want to go go deeper into the organization, like you said, it's really all about internal philosophy as opposed to any kind of external messaging. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, if a company is really looking to just get external credit for having ownership guidelines, they could limit coverage to just the named executive officers or that very select group. But for those that are trying to achieve a broader objective, it really just is a question, what's the right fit with your culture and with your pay philosophy. But yeah, to get external credit, you only need to cover your named executive officers.
Okay. So we've established what a guideline is. We've established kind of who participates. Jeff, maybe we can dive into a little bit of what exactly is considered ownership. Like what types of shares fall into that definition of ownership, and how do you enforce compliance with that? How do companies typically measure that?
Sure. Yeah, and this is another one where there's not a universal approach, but there's certainly practices that are more common than others. A good example of this, in addition to, of course, you're counting shares that are owned outright by the executives, typically shares that have vested through the LTI program. But most companies also count shares that are held in retirement plans, shares beneficially owned or held in trusts. Companies count shares that are held in deferral programs as well. And I'd say this is all intuitive, right? These are all generally shares that are owned by the executive. But it's actually also common practice to count unvested time-based RSUs. And I'd say probably 3/4 of companies count unvested time-based RSUs. What's the rationale for this, right? RSUs, I guess the viewpoint is that they're going to be earned regardless of stock performance, performance of the company. Essentially, if executive remains in the role and until the end of the vesting period, then they're going to receive the RSU grant. So no issues with counting that in the ownership guidelines when the award is granted versus when it vests. And if you look at externally, ISS, Glass Lewis, the proxy advisory firms, they don't have an issue with this approach either. So again, common market practice, but there is a word of caution here as well, right? Some companies, if we think about their LTI mix, they grant a significant portion of equity in time-based RSUs, upwards of 50% of an LTI program could be time-based RSUs. And if you're counting that for the ownership guideline, right, this is often measured pre-tax, right? The RSUs haven't been taxed yet because they haven't vested yet. And if you're comparing that to the rest of the equity or the stock that are included in the stock ownership guideline calculation, that is post-tax holdings, right? So often shares are withheld at vest to cover the taxes. So it could be up to half of the value that was granted. And because of this, there's that potential that an unvested RSU actually has an outsized percentage of the value of the stock ownership guideline, right? When you're going through the calculation, you're looking at compliance. Those that are holding unvested RSUs might be a higher portion of their overall holdings. So I'm not suggesting that companies need to stop counting unvested RSUs. As I said, it's probably a 75% prevalence in the market. I do think that it's important to understand what the impact of those unvested RSUs are, and recognizing that if the unvested RSUs account for, say, over half of the holdings or more than half of the holdings, may be an indication that a change is needed. And I don't think this is uncommon. I've seen unvested RSUs count for 80%, even 100% of the unvested holdings. That doesn't mean that executives are going to go out and immediately sell everything they hold, right? I think that they recognize there's certainly a benefit to holding vested shares. Sometimes companies are discouraging executives from selling any shares, regardless of what your ownership policy said. So it doesn't necessarily mean, or maybe it's not necessarily noticed, or doesn't necessarily mean that a change has to be made. But again, I think it's important to understand what the impact of an unvested RSU has on your program.
Yeah. So Ron, what about some of the other vehicles out there? PSUs, which most companies are making up a significant portion of equity grants each year, and things like stock options. Are those ever counted towards ownership? And if so, what are some of the considerations there?
Jeff makes a good point about periodically assessing compliance with guidelines. And one point I would add is, this is a good reminder to periodically review the guidelines and review ownership levels. So if the guidelines aren't achieving actual ownership levels as intended, then companies could look at a tweak or two to the guidelines if it's really not achieving the core objective. So for example, you could limit the percentage of RSUs that count towards the guideline compliance. So it could be, for example, no more than 75% or no more than 60%, whatever the right percentage is, can be achieved through RSUs. But it's just a reminder to look at ownership levels over time, not just compliance with the guidelines, and make sure that the core objective is being achieved.
Yeah, a good point. I will ask my follow-up again here. So Ron, what about some of these other long-term incentive vehicles that are very common? PSUs obviously are a big part of most companies. LTI mix, stock options are still very prevalent. Are those two vehicles ever included in the definition of ownership? And if they are, what are some of the considerations we should be thinking about?
Yeah, no doubt, stock options, performance shares are a large component of executive long-term incentive programs. But over time, it has now become a small minority practice to count either vested stock options or performance shares in determining compliance with ownership guidelines. And really, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the performance shares, they're at risk. It's unclear whether and to what extent they'll be earned. And so it's just been a common practice now to not count performance shares until they're earned. Similarly with stock options, yes, even though vested in the money options really have a tangible value, that value can fluctuate rather quickly based on changes in stock price performance. So most companies do not count stock options or performance shares in determining compliance with guidelines. It's a small minority practice at this point. But another external consideration is one of the large proxy advisors, Institutional Shareholder Services, recently updated its executive compensation policies, and they will not consider ownership guidelines to be, in their terms, robust if performance shares or stock options are included in determining compliance. And so if they don't consider your guidelines robust, essentially what that means is when they publish the proxy analysis in connection with your proxy statement, in their model, you will not get credit for having adopted ownership guidelines. So they'll essentially treat you in their analysis as not having adopted any type of stock ownership guidelines for your executive team. And then what we've also seen in the last one or two proxy seasons is, absent an express statement in a company's proxy or compensation discussion and analysis section of the proxy, that performance shares and stock options are not in fact counted, companies will also not receive credit for having adopted robust ownership guidelines. So even if you don't count stock options or performance shares, if you don't make that statement and make that clear to ISS, they'll assume you do and count them, and they will not give you credit for having adopted ownership guidelines. So it's just something to keep in mind as we approach the 2026 proxy season, to make sure to include that statement so that you don't unintentionally lose credit for your ownership guidelines.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add on, because Ron makes a really good point about stock options. This gets back to your program might dictate what the right stock ownership policy is. If you grant a large amount of your LTI in stock options, certainly you're not trying to encourage executives to exercise those options early just to comply with their ownership guidelines. You're likely not counting stock ownership or stock options within the calculation, within the policy. So that might result in a need to have a different a different value that's required to be achieved, because you don't want to have an unintended consequence or inadvertently encourage early exercise of stock options just to meet those requirements.
Yep. That makes sense. So one quick follow-up, and this is for Jeff, you or Ron, but one issue that I often see companies get into when stock price declines dramatically is all of a sudden executives that were in compliance are out of compliance. How do you see companies address that? Are there ways to kind of address that? Do they put their ownership guidelines on hold? Do they kind of restart the period of time to build ownership back up? Or what is a way to kind of address that particular issue?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in here. And one way companies sometimes will do this is they'll have a policy in place to say, once you've achieved the ownership guideline, right, which is often based on a dollar value, that those shares that you own, then lock you into having, as long as you're holding that same number of shares, regardless of the price fluctuation, of the stock price fluctuation, you're deemed to be in compliance. That's one way to do it. Other companies might use larger stock price averages to determine compliance. I've seen upwards of 365 days, so a full year average to determine compliance, so that you don't have wild fluctuations in the value that, because of stock price movement, executives are in compliance or out of compliance.
Right.
Yeah, and you can really have a whipsaw effect in that scenario you paint, Ryan, which does happen during various parts of the economic cycle, where if the stock market drops precipitously, you might have executives that went from in compliance to out of compliance, and now you're telling them, potentially, you think about the broader economics of that situation, maybe the bonuses aren't paying out, and all of your holdings are worth less, and now we need you to go on the market and buy a lot more stock, even though your net worth just went down, probably pretty significantly. And so another way around that, it is somewhat administrative, but another way around that is to give executives credit for kind of the greater of the kind of the stock price when it vested or when it was purchased and the current fair market value. So that's another way to protect against a sudden dip in the price having kind of a whipsaw effect on the executives.
Yeah, and another kind of one of my favorite ways to address this is actually through holding requirements, which was the next thing I wanted to ask you about, Jeff. Is, we hear about holding requirements versus ownership guidelines. What is a holding requirement? How is it different? And do you have both of those, or do you just need one of them?
Yeah, no, that's a good call out, Ryan. And if we step back, right, we really haven't seen much movement in stock ownership guidelines in the kind of the structure of the guidelines in recent years. But the stock holding requirements and the addition of stock holding requirements is really where we've seen a growing trend. To answer your question directly, yeah, there's certainly a benefit of having both of these policies. And I think holding requirements really is near, I'd say 75% prevalence, where if we look back 5-7 years, these were minority practices. So what this is it's a requirement in place, often structured as a requirement to hold a percentage of shares at the vesting of each award. So after annual vesting, you're required to hold a percentage of shares until your ownership guideline is met. There's different ways to structure this holding requirement, but that's the most common and typically referred to as a hold until met policy. The percentage of shares you're required to hold at vesting can vary, right? And we've seen this from 50% of your vested shares to 100% of your vested shares. This is often looked at as an after-tax shares because typically executives they withhold shares to settle the tax. So an after tax could be required to hold 50% up until 100% of their shares up until that guideline is met. And what this does is it really ensures that executive is working towards the ownership guideline from the beginning. We'll avoid a situation where perhaps there's as Ron was talking about at the beginning, there may be a 5-year requirement or a 5-year timeline to meet your requirements. And it avoids a situation where you get to the 5-year point and you haven't achieved the requirement, maybe because you sold a large chunk of the shares a few years earlier. So it's really to make sure that there's consistent holding as you're working up to the ownership requirement. And maybe one add-on, the fact that the trend that we're seeing is for companies to put in these holding requirements and actually remove the time period requirement. So in that example, the 5-year requirement, we've seen companies eliminate that because if you're requiring executives to hold a certain percentage of shares each year, of course, if it's 100% of the shares and they're not selling any stock, then they're just going to achieve that ownership guideline over time. Right. But even if you're requiring them to hold 50% or 75% of the vested shares, if the expectation is you're going to achieve that in a reasonable time, just by holding that percentage of shares at each vesting, then there's not a necessity to have a time requirement as well. And it eliminates any kind of disclosure you'd have to make to say an executive that hasn't achieved it by the deadline. And eliminates you needing to take any action if an executive doesn't achieve the guideline by a specific deadline, which frankly, the reason that often happens isn't because executives sell shares. It's more likely than the scenario you described, the stock price drops or PSUs aren't earned at the level that was expected. And that results in executives not going to meeting those ownership requirements by a certain time frame.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the use of holding requirements, and it's something I've advised a lot of companies to incorporate into their guidelines for all the reasons you just said. I think it just really it simplifies the approach, and the executive team can really just understand that, hey, as long as I'm retaining a certain amount of my grant, I know I'm in compliance regardless of what stock price does, and at some point I exceed the guideline. But until then, I just all I have to do is just hold a certain amount of after tax stock. So I think it's a nice simple way to approach that. Um, so I think we've covered a lot of the fundamentals of guidelines, and this has really been a good conversation. Any kind of final thoughts of anything that you think would be valuable for people to understand about ownership guidelines?
One point I might add is it's a good practice for companies to take a look at their ownership guidelines periodically, and just understand, are they still competitive with market? What are recent trends? We've mentioned a few today, and whether any internal or external changes might merit reexamination of the structure of guidelines, the covered group of executives, the time period as we just discussed for compliance or method for compliance, and the tiering of ownership requirements within the policy. So just a reminder to take a fresh look periodically every 2 to 3 years, just to make sure the guidelines continue to meet your organization's objectives and remain consistent with any changes internally or externally.
Great. Well, Jeff, Ron, thanks again for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.